This is a flocking model. So I talked about the bird flocks and how they fly around. There's 3 rules in this model, right? Don't crash into another bird. Stay relatively close to the flock, however. Don't get too far away from the flock. And 3, fly in the same general direction as the other ones around you. That's basically the rule set. You run this model, and it's amazing. I wish I could do a live video of this because it's mesmerizing. You can sit there and watch this, these birds flying around on your screen for hours because it behaves exactly like you mentally think of a bird flock flying. Okay. The one thing about these systems, though, is because these decisions are being made very independently by these agents, it's very, very difficult. It's pretty much impossible to predict the behavior of a truly complex system. You cannot precisely say, this will happen at this time with this environment in the future. And the reason for that is because there's so many factors, so many influences on the environment and on the system, that a small differentiation in terms of what one actor does within the system can have a profound effect on the outcome of the system overall. So we end up with these situations where things become pretty unpredictable. Since I was talking about birds earlier, let me bring up the bird die-off that happened last year, a little over a year ago, in Alabama in the South, and all the way to California. What's fascinating about this is some of it was disease-related. Some of it seemed to be behavioral. People were talking about in California along I-5 seeing flocks of crows where the crows would one by one fly into the front of moving semi-trucks. Just they would fly right down into the front of the truck. And what causes that? Right? What trigger made a flock of birds make these decisions to kind of do these kinds of activities? Another great example is what happened with the Deepwater Horizon explosion. You may say, well, somebody made a bad decision or somebody didn't stay on top of their job or somebody, but it's not the way it works. The way it works is that many, many little decisions which were entirely rational at the time that decision was made across all of BP, all those decisions added up to a situation where they were actually more vulnerable to failure and disaster than they were before the decisions were made, right? So you make a bunch of decisions where you're like, hey, let's cut a low cost by doing this, or we're going to use this vendor instead of this vendor, all of which is fine, most of which don't result in a disaster right away. So you live with it and you go, see, that was a good decision. I saved the company X amount of money and that was really good. And these guys over here make a different decision you know nothing about that somehow weakens it a little bit more. And ultimately what happened here was that a series of decisions made was that BP was not only was the system designed in a way that disaster was very much more likely to happen than they thought it was, but their preparedness to deal with it was much less than they thought it was. That's a feeling that I think that a lot of people right now, especially in the enterprise, frankly, are feeling about how do I get control and maintain control of my environment. So what can you do? The first thing I'm going to say is embrace complexity. All right, and some of you are, no, complexity bad, never. Well, okay, let me change it slightly. Embrace complex systems. Begin to understand the science. Begin to understand the concept of systems thinking. Tons of work out there, and I'm going to talk you through some very practical ways that you can do exactly this. So the practical advice. First, do your homework. There's no excuse right now for not going home and saying, okay, I've got to begin to understand this. The second piece of advice I want to give you is to design for resilience. There's a really fascinating theory that's come out of all of this that I think everybody needs to understand if they're doing distributed systems and they're doing cloud computing. What happens is if you focus on trying to maximize the output of a system and to stabilize the throughput of a system and get it to the point where everything is completely predictable and where the system doesn't fail in the sense that no component of the system fails. It's a very static, fixed system that's built to do one thing extremely well. What happens is you end up with a more stable system of reduced resilience, meaning if the environment around that system changes significantly for some reason out of your control, all of a sudden the system is unable to cope with that change, and the entire system fails to meet the requirement. There's no way for the system to recover from that, and you've got to go back to the drawing board and figure out how to deal with it. If you design for resilience, this whole design for failure theme that's out there, this whole design to allow for components to go away and come back, or to have reduced performance and to still deal with it. If you design for resilience, if you design for that, you design for resilience. You design for the ability for the system as a whole to survive negative elements of the environment around it and within it. It's called the resiliency stability trade-off. And one of the symptoms of it is the more stable your system is, the more the agents in the system adapt to the stability of the system, and the less capable they are of reacting to anything other than that environment. Third thing is to focus on relationships, and I think this is a really critical thing. We spend so much time designing the individual components that we run in environments and designing the architecture of the individual elements that we lose the fact that in a complex environment, the thing that you're really concerned about is what happens with the other guy. What happens if something breaks that went away? So in this model, what's really interesting about what we saw in the market example was what the markets themselves came back and said was broken once they'd done all this research is they said, we didn't have enough things in the middle between all these different trading algorithms in the market, between the markets. We didn't have enough circuit breakers in place in order to be able to stop the negative behavior before it went out of control and spiraled out of control. And their action to take out of the flash crash was to design more and better circuit breakers to put into the market trading system so that if something starts to spin out of control a little bit more, however way it happens, it doesn't, not this specific scenario again, but looking across a variety of ways that can do it, that they can actually stop the activity long enough for everything to reset and get back to normal trading. The last piece of advice, practical advice I want to give around systems thinking and cloud is to avoid drift. So I talked about a little bit the Deepwater Horizon incident and what happened with that, and so I won't go through it again, but that idea that a decision that you make as a vendor or a decision that you make as a developer working on a given platform or a given infrastructure service or whatever it is seems completely logical at the time, but might be negatively affected by all the other decisions that have been made in the environment by others. Other developers within your company, the customers that decide to use your product in a way you never predicted, things along those lines. Those are situations in which drift begins to happen, and it's very common that it happens. It's something that's very difficult to counter, except that there are some techniques you can use to counter.